History of terrorism. The history of terrorism is a history of well-known and historically significant individuals, entities, and incidents associated, whether rightly or wrongly, with terrorism. Scholars agree that terrorism is a disputed term, and very few of those labeled terrorists describe themselves as such. It is common for opponents in a violent conflict. Depending on how broadly the term is defined, the roots and practice of terrorism can be traced at least to the 1st century AD Sicarii Zealots, though some dispute whether the group, which assassinated collaborators with Roman rule in the province of Judea, was in fact terrorist. The first use in English of the term terrorism occurred during the French Revolution's reign of terror, when the Jacobins, who ruled the revolutionary state, employed violence, including mass executions by guillotine, to compel obedience to the state and intimidate regime enemies. The association of the term only with state violence and intimidation lasted until the mid-19th century, when it began to be associated with non-governmental groups. Anarchism, often in league with rising nationalism and anti-monarchism, was the most prominent ideology linked with terrorism. Near the end of the 19th century, anarchist groups or individuals committed assassinations of a Russian Tsar and a U.S. president. In the 20th century, terrorism continued to be associated with a vast array of anarchist, socialist, fascist, and nationalist groups, many of them engaged in Third World independence struggles. Some scholars also labeled as terrorist the systematic internal violence and intimidation practiced by states such as the Stalinist Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Definition and definition. Though many have been proposed, there is no consensus definition of the term terrorism. This in part derives from the fact that the term is politically and emotionally charged, a word with intrinsically negative connotations that is generally applied to one's enemies and opponents. The term terrorist is believed to have originated during the Reign of Terror, September 5, 1793, July 28, 1794, in France. It was a period of 11 months during the French Revolution when the ruling Jacobins employed violence, including mass executions by guillotine, in order to intimidate the regime's enemies and compel obedience to the state. The Jacobins, most famously Robespierre, sometimes referred to themselves as terrorists. Some modern scholars, however, do not consider the Reign of Terror a form of terrorism, in part because it was carried out by the French state. French historian Sophie Wanish distinguishes between the revolutionary terror of the French Revolution and the terrorists of the September 11 attacks. Revolutionary terror is not terrorism. To make a moral equivalence between the Revolution's year Roman II and September 2001 is historical and philosophical nonsense. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. And since the violence exercised on 11 September 2001 aimed neither at equality nor liberty, nor did the preventive war announced by the President of the United States. Early terrorism. Scholars dispute whether the roots of terrorism date back to the 1st century and the Sicarii Zealots, to the 11th century and the Hashishin, to the 19th century and the Fenian Brotherhood and Narodnaya, or to other eras. The Sicarii and the Hashishin are described below, while the Fenian Brotherhood and Narodnaya are discussed in the 19th century subsection. Other pre-Reign of Terror historical events sometimes associated with terrorism include the Gunpowder Plot, an attempt to destroy the English Parliament in 1605. During the 1st century CE, the Jewish Zealots in Judea province rebelled, killing prominent collaborators with Roman rule. In 6th CE, according to contemporary historian Josephus, Judas of Galilee formed a small and more extreme offshoot of the Zealots, the Sicarii dagger men. Their efforts were also directed against Jewish collaborators, including temple priests, Sadducees, Herodians, and other wealthy elites. According to Josephus, the Sicarii would hide short daggers under their cloaks, mingle with crowds at large festivals, murder their victims, and then disappear into the panicked crowds. Their most successful assassination was of the high priest of Israel, Jonathan. In the late 11th century, the Hashishin, aka the Assassins, arose, an offshoot of the Ismaili sect of Shia Muslims. Led by Hassan Saba and opposed to Fatimid and Seljuk rule, the Hashishin militia seized Alamat and other fortress strongholds across Persia. Hashishin forces were too small to challenge enemies militarily, so they assassinated city governors and military commanders in order to create alliances with militarily powerful neighbors. For example, they killed Jana al-Dawla, ruler of Homs, to please Ridwan of Aleppo, and assassinated Madad, Seljuk emir of Mosul, as a favor to the regent of Damascus. The Hashishin also carried out assassinations as retribution. Under some definitions of terrorism, such assassinations do not qualify as terrorism, since killing a political leader does not intimidate political enemies or inspire revolt. See also List of assassinations by the Assassins. The Sons of Liberty was a clandestine group that formed in Boston and New York City in the 1770s. It had a political agenda of independence of Britain's American colonies. The groups engaged in several acts that could be considered terroristic and used the deeds for propaganda purposes. Gunpowder Plot. On November 5, 1605, a group of conspirators led by Robert Catesby they planned in secret to detonate a large quantity of gunpowder placed beneath the Palace of Westminster. The gunpowder was procured and placed by Guy Fawkes. The group intended to enact a coup by killing King James I and the members of both Houses of Parliament. The conspirators planned to make one of the king's children a puppet monarch and then restore the Catholic faith to England. The conspirator leased a coal cellar beneath the House of Lords and began stockpiling gunpowder in 1604. As well as its primary targets, it would have killed hundreds, if not thousands, of Londoners, the most devastating act of terrorism in Britain's history, plunging the nation into a religious war. English spymasters uncovered the plot and caught Guy Fawkes with the gunpowder beneath Parliament. The other conspirators fled to Holbeach in Staffordshire. A shootout on November 8 with authorities led to the deaths of Robert Catesby, Thomas Percy, and the brothers Christopher and John Wright. The rest were captured. Fawkes and 7 others were tried and executed in January 1606. The planned attack has become known as the Gunpowder Plot and is commemorated in Britain every November 5 with fireworks displays and large bonfires with effigies of Guy Fawkes, and the Pope are often burned. Comparisons are often drawn between Gunpowder Plot and modern religious terrorism, such as the attacks in the U.S. by Islamic terrorists on 9/11/2001. Emergence of modern terrorism. Terrorism was associated with state terror and the reign of terror in France until the mid-19th century, when the term also began to be associated with non-governmental groups. Anarchism, often in league with rising nationalism, was the most prominent ideology linked with terrorism. Attacks by various anarchist groups led to the assassination of a Russian Tsar and a U.S. president. In the 19th century, powerful, stable, and affordable explosives were developed, global integration reached unprecedented levels, and often radical political movements became widely influential. The use of dynamite, in particular, inspired anarchists and was central to their strategic thinking. Ireland. One of the earliest groups to utilize modern terrorist techniques was arguably the Fenian Brotherhood and its offshoot, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They were both founded in 1858 as revolutionary, militant nationalist and Catholic groups, both in Ireland and amongst the emigre community in the United States. After centuries of continued British rule, and being influenced most recently from the devastating effects of the 1840s Great Famine, these revolutionary fraternal organizations were founded with the aim of establishing an independent republic. In 1867, members of the movement's leadership were arrested and convicted for organizing an armed uprising. While being transferred to prison, the police van in which they were being transported was intercepted, and a police sergeant was shot in the rescue. A bolder rescue attempt of another Irish radical incarcerated in Clerkenwell Prison was made in the same year. An explosion to demolish the prison wall killed 12 people and caused many injuries. The bombing enraged the British public, causing a panic over the Fenian threat. Although the Irish Republican Brotherhood condemned the Clerkenwell outrage as a dreadful and deplorable event, the organization returned to bombings in Britain in 1881 to 1885 with the Fenian Dynamite Campaign, beginning one of the first modern terror campaigns. Instead of earlier forms of terrorism based on political assassination, this campaign used modern, timed explosives with the express aim of sowing fear in the very heart of metropolitan Britain in order to achieve political gains. Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone was partly influenced to disestablish the Anglican Church in Ireland as a gesture by the Clerkenwell bombing. The campaign also took advantage of the greater global integration of the times, and the bombing was largely funded and organized by the Fenian Brotherhood in the United States. The first police unit to combat terrorism was established in 1883 by the Metropolitan Police, initially as a small section of the Criminal Investigation Department. It was known as the Special Irish Branch and was trained in counter-terrorism techniques to combat the Irish Republican Brotherhood. The unit's name was changed to Special Branch as the unit's remit steadily widened over the years. Russia. The concept of propaganda of the deed, or propaganda by the deed, from the French propagande par le fait, advocated physical violence or other provocative public acts against political enemies in order to inspire mass rebellion or revolution. One of the first individuals associated with this concept, the Italian revolutionary Carlo Pisacane (1818–1857), wrote in his Political Testament 1857 that ideas spring from deeds and not the other way around. Anarchist Mikhail Bakunin (1814–1876), in his Letters to a Frenchman on the Present Crisis 1870, stated that we must spread our principles, not with words but with deeds, for this is the most popular, the most potent, and the most irresistible form of propaganda. The French anarchist Paul Brousse (1844–1912) popularized the phrase propaganda of the deed in 1877. He cited as examples the 1871 Paris Commune and a workers' demonstration in Bern provocatively using the socialist red flag. By the 1880s, the slogan had begun to be used to refer to bombings, regicides, and tyrannicides. Reflecting this new understanding of the term, in 1895 Italian anarchist Enrico Malatesta described propaganda by the deed, which he opposed the use of as violent communal insurrections meant to ignite an imminent revolution. Founded in Russia in 1878, Narodnaya Volia in Russian, People's Will in English, was a revolutionary anarchist group inspired by Sergei Nechayev and by propaganda by the deed theorist Pisacane. The group developed ideas such as targeted killing of the leaders of oppression that would become the hallmark of subsequent violence by small non-state groups, and they were convinced that the developing technologies of the age, such as the invention of dynamite, which they were the first anarchist group to make widespread use of, enabled them to strike directly and with discrimination. Attempting to spark a popular revolt against Russian Tsardom, the group killed prominent political figures by gun and bomb, and on March 13, 1881, assassinated Russia's Tsar Alexander Roman II. The assassination by a bomb that also killed the Tsar's attacker, Ignacy Hrynuyki, failed to spark the expected revolution, and an ensuing crackdown brought the group to an end. Individual Europeans also engaged in politically motivated violence. For example, in 1893, Auguste Vaillant, a French anarchist, threw a bomb in the French Chamber of Deputies. In reaction to Vaillant's bombing and other bombings and assassination attempts, the French government restricted freedom of the press by passing a set of laws that became pejoratively known as the Lois Celerate's villainous laws. In the years 1894 to to 1896, anarchists killed President of France Marie Francois Carnot, Prime Minister of Spain Antonio Canovas del Castello, and the Empress of Austria-Hungary Elizabeth of Bavaria. The United States. Prior to the American Civil War, abolitionist John Brown (1800–1859) advocated and practiced armed opposition to slavery, launching several attacks between 1856 and 1859. His most famous attack was launched against the armory at Harper's Ferry in 1859. Local forces soon recaptured the fort, and Brown was tried and executed for treason. A biographer of Brown has written that Brown's purpose was to force the nation into a new political pattern by creating terror. In 2009, the 150th anniversary of Brown's death, prominent news publications debated over whether or not Brown should be considered a terrorist. After the Civil War, on December 24, 1865, 6 Confederate veterans founded the Ku Klux Klan (KKK). The KKK used violence, lynching, murder, and acts of intimidation such as cross burning to oppress African Americans in particular, and it created a sensation with its masked foray's dramatic nature. The group's politics were white supremacist, anti-Semitic, racist, anti-Catholic, and nativist. A KKK founder boasted that it was a nationwide organization of 550,000 men and that it could muster 40,000 Klansmen within 5 days' notice, but as a secret or invisible group with no membership rosters, it was difficult to judge the Klan's actual size. The KKK has been politically powerful at times, and at various times it controlled the governments of Tennessee, Oklahoma, Indiana, and South Carolina, as well as several legislatures in the South. The Ottoman Empire. Several nationalist groups used violence against an Ottoman Empire in apparent decline. One was the Armenian Revolutionary Federation in Armenian-Sufism, or the Federation, a revolutionary movement founded in Tiflis, Russian Transcaucasia, in 1890 by Christopher Mikhailian. Many members had been part of Narodnaya Volya, or the Hunchakian Revolutionary Party. The group published newsletters, smuggled arms, and hijacked buildings as it sought to bring in European intervention that would force the Ottoman Empire to surrender control of its Armenian territories. On August 24, 1896, 17-year-old Babkin Sunni led 26 members in capturing the Imperial Ottoman Bank in Constantinople. The group demanded European intervention in order to stop the Hamidian massacres and the creation of an Armenian state, but backed down on a threat to blow up the bank. An ensuing security crackdown destroyed the group. Also inspired by Narodnaya Volya, the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization (IMRO) was a revolutionary movement founded in 1893 by Atristo Tatarshev in the Ottoman-controlled Macedonian territories. Through assassinations and by provoking uprisings, the group sought to coerce the Ottoman government into creating a Macedonian nation. On July 20, 1903, the group incited the Ilindan uprising in the Ottoman Vilayet of Monastir. The IMRO declared the town's independence and sent demands to the European powers that all of Macedonia be freed. The demands were ignored, and Turkish troops crushed the 27,000 rebels in the town 2 months later. Early 20th century. Revolutionary nationalism continued to motivate political violence in the 20th century, much of it directed against Western powers. The Irish Republican Army campaigned against the British in the 1910s, and their tactics inspired Zionist groups such as the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi to in their guerrilla war against the Palestine Mandate throughout the 1930s. Like the IRA and the Zionist groups, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt used bombings and assassinations as part of their tactic. Militant suffragettes of the Women's Social and Political Union carried out a series of politically motivated bombing and arson attacks nationwide as part of their campaign for women's suffrage. There were 3 phases of WSPU militancy in 1905–1908, and, most significantly, between 1912 and 1914. These actions ranged from civil disobedience and destruction of public property to arson and bombings. Most notably, the WSPU bombed government minister and future Prime Minister David Lloyd George's House. Political assassinations continued, resulting in the assassinations of King Umberto I of Italy, killed in July 1900, and U.S. President William McKinley in September 1901. Political violence became especially widespread in Imperial Russia, and several ministers were killed in the opening years of the 20th century. The highest ranking was Prime Minister Pyotr Stolypin, killed in 1911 by Dmitry Bagrov, a spy for the secret police in several anarchist, socialist, and other revolutionary groups. On June 28, 1914, Gavrilo Princip, one of a group of 6 assassins, shot and killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, in Sarajevo, the capital of the Condominion of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The assassinations produced widespread shock across Europe, setting in motion a series of events which led to World War I in the 1930s. The Nazi regime in Germany and Stalin's rule in the Soviet Union practiced state terror systematically and on a massive and unprecedented scale. Meanwhile, the Stalin regime branded its opponents with the label terrorist. Suffragette bombing and arson campaign. Suffragettes in Great Britain and Ireland orchestrated a bombing and arson campaign between the years 1912 and 1914. The campaign was instigated by the Women's Social and Political Union WSPU and was a part of their wider campaign for women's suffrage. The campaign, led by key WSPU figures such as Emmeline Pankhurst, targeted infrastructure, government, churches, and the general public, and saw the use of improvised explosive devices, arson, letter bombs, assassination attempts, and other forms of direct action and violence. At least 5 people were killed in such attacks, including 1 suffragette, and at least 24 were injured, including 2 suffragettes. The campaign was halted at the outbreak of war in August 1914 without having brought about votes for women, as suffragettes pledged to pause their campaigning to aid the nation's war effort. The campaign has seen classification as a terrorist campaign, with both suffragettes themselves and the authorities referring to arson and bomb attacks as terrorism. Contemporary press reports also referred to attacks as terrorist incidents in both the United Kingdom and in the United States. In one of the more serious suffragette attacks, during the suffragette bombing and arson campaign of 1912-1914, a major terrorist incident occurred in the Portsmouth in 1913, which led to the deaths of 2 men. A fire was purposely started at Portsmouth Dockyard on 20 December 1913, in which 2 sailors were killed after it spread through the industrial area. The fire spread rapidly as there were many old wooden buildings in the area, including the historic Semaphore Tower, which dated back to the 18th century, which was completely destroyed. The damage to the dockyard area cost the city £200,000. In the midst of the firestorm, a battleship, HMS Queen Mary, had to be towed to safety to avoid the flames. The attack was notable enough to be reported on in the press in the United States, with the New York Times reporting on the disaster 2 days after with the headline "Big Portsmouth Fire Loss." The report also disclosed that at a previous police raid on a suffragette headquarters, papers were discovered disclosing a plan to fire the yard. The campaign in part provided the inspiration for later bombing and terrorist campaigns in Britain, such as those conducted by the Irish Republican Army IRA. The plan of 1939 to 1940 utilized the tactic of undertaking incendiary attacks on pillar boxes and also saw the planting of explosive devices. The tactic of packing nuts and bolts into bombs to act as shrapnel, often regarded as a later 20th century IRA invention, was also first employed by the suffragettes. Several suffragette bombings, such as the attempted bombing of Liverpool Street Station in 1913, saw the use of this method. The combination of high-explosive bombs, incendiary devices, and letter bombs used by suffragettes also provided the pattern for the IRA campaigns of the 1970s and 1980s. Unknown to many, the first terrorist bomb to explode in Northern Ireland in the 20th century was not detonated by the IRA but by the suffragettes at Lisburn Cathedral in August 1914. Suffragette tactics also provided a template for more contemporary attacks in Britain. Irish independence. In an action called the Easter Rising or Easter Rebellion on April 24, 1916, members of the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army seized the Dublin General Post Office and several other buildings, proclaiming an independent Irish republic. The rebellion failed militarily but was a success for physical force Irish republicanism, leaders of the uprising becoming heroes in Ireland after their eventual sentence of capital punishment by the British government. Shortly after the rebellion, Michael Collins and others founded the Irish Republican Army IRA, which from 1916 to 1923 carried out numerous attacks against the British authorities. For example, it attacked over 300 police stations simultaneously just before Easter 1920, and in November 1920 publicly killed a dozen police officers and burned down the Liverpool docks and warehouses, an action that became known as Bloody Sunday. After years of warfare, London agreed to the 1921 Anglo-Irish Treaty creating a Free Irish state encompassing 26 of the island's 32 counties. IRA tactics were an inspiration to other groups, including the Palestine Mandates Zionists, and to British special operations during World War II. The IRA are considered by some the innovators of modern insurgency tactics, as the British would replicate and build upon the tactics used against them in World War II against the Germans and Italians. Tony Girardi in the Irish War. The hidden conflict between the IRA and British intelligence wrote, "The Irish, thanks to the example set by Collins and followed by the SOE, can thus claim that their resistance provide the originating impulse for resistance to tyrannies worse than any they had to endure themselves. And the Irish resistance, as Collins led it, showed the rest of the world an economical way to fight wars, the only sane way they can be fought in the age of the nuclear bomb." From January 1939 to March 1940, the Irish Republican Army IRA carried out a campaign of bombing and sabotage against the civil, economic, and military infrastructure of Britain. It was known as the S-Plan or Sabotage Campaign. During the campaign, the IRA carried out almost 300 attacks and acts of sabotage in Britain, killing 7 people and injuring 96. Most of the casualties occurred in the Coventry bombing on 25 August 1939. Mandatory Palestine. Following the 1929 Hebron massacre of 67 Jews in the Mandate of Palestine, the Zionist militia Haganah transformed itself into a paramilitary force. In 1931, however, the more militant Irgun broke away from Haganah, objecting to Haganah's policy of restraint. Founded by Avraham Tahomi, Irgun sought to aggressively defend Jews from Arab attacks. Its tactic of attacking Arab communities, including the bombing of a crowded Arab market, is among the first examples of terrorism directed against civilians. After the British published the White Paper of 1939, which placed strict restrictions on Jewish immigration into Palestine, which was seen as unacceptable to Zionist groups, the Irgun began a campaign against the British authorities by assassinating police, capturing British government buildings and arms, and sabotaging railways. Irgun's best-known attack targeted the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, parts of which housed the headquarters of the British civil and military administrations. The bombing in 1946 killed 91 people and injured 46, making it the most deadly attack during the Mandate era. This attack was sharply condemned by the organized leadership of the Yishuv and further widened the gulf between David Ben-Gurion's Haganah and Begin's Irgun. Following the bombing, Ben-Gurion called Irgun an enemy of the Jewish people. After the founding of the State of Israel in 1948, Menachem Begin, Irgun leader from 1943 to 1948, transformed the group into the political party Herut, which later became part of Likud in an alliance with the center-right Gahal Liberal Party, Free Center, nationalist, and movement for Greater Israel. On the 60th anniversary of the bombing, a plaque was unveiled at the hotel. Operating in the Palestine Mandate in the 1930s, Izzeddin al-Qassem 1882–1935 organized and established the Black Hand, a Palestinian nationalist militia. He recruited and arranged military training for peasants and by 1935 had enlisted between 200 and 800 men. Al-Qassem obtained a fatwa from Sheikh Badr al-Din al-Taji al-Hassani, the Mufti of Damascus, authorizing an armed insurgency against the British and against the Jews of Palestine. Black Hand cells were equipped with bombs and firearms, which they used to kill Jews. Although al-Qassem's revolt was unsuccessful in his lifetime, many organizations gained inspiration from his example. He became a popular hero and an inspiration to subsequent Arab militants, who in the 1936–39 Arab Revolt called themselves Qassemiyan, followers of al-Qassem. The Izz ad-Din al-Qassem Brigades, the military wing of Hamas, as well as the rockets they developed, take their names after Qassem. Lahai Lohamei Heret Yisrael aka Freedom Fighters for Israel aka the Stern Gang was a revisionist Zionist group that splintered off from Irgun in 1940. Abraham Stern formed Lahai from disaffected Irgun members after Irgun agreed to a truce with Britain in 1940. Lahai assassinated prominent politicians as a strategy. For example, on November 6, 1944, Lord Moyne, the British Minister of State for the Middle East, was assassinated. The act was controversial among Zionist militant groups, Haganah sympathizing with the British in this instance and launching a massive manhunt against members of Lahai and Irgun. After Israel's 1948 founding, Lahai formally dissolved and its members became integrated into the Israeli Defense Forces. Resistance during World War II. Some of the tactics of the guerrilla, partisan, and resistance movements organized and supplied by the Allies during World War II, according to historian M.R.D. Foote, can be considered terrorist. Colin Gubbins, a key leader within the Special Operations Executive SOE, made sure the organization drew much of its inspiration from the IRA. On the eve of D-Day, the SOE organized with the French resistance the complete destruction of the rail and communication infrastructure of Western France, the largest coordinated attack of its kind in history, Allied Supreme Commander Dwight. The SOE also conducted operations in Africa, the Middle East, and the Far East. The work of the SOE received recognition in 2009 with a memorial in London. However, there are differing views on the morality of the SOE actions. The British military historian John Keegan writing, "We must recognize that our response to the scourge of terrorism is compromised by what we did through SOE. The justification, Haitian, 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 Vacation, 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 justification, justification, vacation, vacation, that we had no other means of striking back at the enemy, is exactly the argument used by the Red Brigades, the Baader-Meinhof Gang, the PFLP, the IRA, and every other half-articulate terrorist organization on earth. Futile to argue that we were a democracy and Hitler a tyrant. Means besmirch ends. SOE besmirched Britain. Post-war period and Cold War proxies. In the aftermath of World War II, largely successful campaigns for independence were launched against the collapsing European empires as many World War II resistance groups became militantly nationalistic. The Viet Minh, for example, which had fought against the Japanese Empire, now fought against the returning French colonists. In the Middle East, the Muslim Brotherhood used bombings and assassinations against the British in Egypt. Also during the 1950s, the National Liberation Front FLN in French-controlled Algeria and the Ethniki Organosis Cyprian Agonistan IACA in British-controlled Cyprus waged guerrilla and open war against the authorities. In the 1960s, inspired by Mao Zedong's Chinese Revolution of 1949 and Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution of 1959, national independence movements often fused nationalist and socialist impulses. This was the case with Spain's ETA, the Front de Liberación du Quebec, and the Palestine Liberation Organization. In the late 1960s and 1970s, violent left-wing militant and revolutionary groups were on the rise, sympathizing with Third World guerrilla movements and seeking to spark anti-capitalist revolts. Such groups included the PKK in Turkey, Armenia's Azala, the Japanese Red Army, the West German Red Army faction RAF, the Monteneros, the Italian Red Brigades BR, and, in the United States, the Weather Underground. Nationalist groups such as the Provisional IRA and the Tamil Tigers also began operations at this time. Throughout the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union made extensive use of violent nationalist organizations to carry on a war by proxy. For example, Soviet and Chinese military advisors provided training and support to the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. The Soviet Union also provided military support to the PLO during the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Fidel Castro during the Cuban Revolution. The United States funded groups such as the Contras in Nicaragua. The Mujahideen of the late 20th and early 21st century had been funded in the 1980s by the United States and other Western powers because they were fighting the USSR in Afghanistan. Middle East, Middle East, 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 East. Founded in 1928 as a nationalist social welfare and political movement in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood began to attack British soldiers and police stations in the late 1940s. Founded and led by Hassan al-Banna, it also assassinated politicians seen as collaborating with British rule, most prominently Egyptian Prime Minister Nakrashi, in 1948. In 1952, a military coup overthrew British rule, and shortly thereafter the Muslim Brotherhood went underground in the face of a massive crackdown. Though sometimes banned or otherwise oppressed by the Egyptian government, the group continues to exist in present-day Egypt. The National Liberation Front FLN was a nationalist group founded in French-controlled Algeria in 1954. The group became a large-scale resistance movement against French rule, with terrorism only part of its operations. The FLN leadership took inspiration from the Viet Minh rebels who had made French troops withdraw from Vietnam. The FLN was one of the first anti-colonial groups to use large-scale compliance violence. The FLN would establish control over a rural village and coerce its peasants to execute any French loyalists among them. On the night of October 31, 1954, in a coordinated wave of 70 bombings and shootings known as the Toussaint Attacks, the FLN attacked French military installations and the homes of Algerian loyalists. In the following year, the group gained significant support for an uprising against loyalists in Philippeville. This uprising, and the heavy-handed response by the French, convinced many Algerians to support the FLN and the independence movement. The FLN eventually secured Algerian independence from France in 1962 and transformed itself into Algeria's ruling party. Fatah was organized as a Palestinian nationalist group in 1954 and exists today as a political party in Palestine. In 1967, it joined the Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO), an umbrella organization for secular Palestinian nationalist groups formed in 1964. The PLO began its own armed operations in 1965. The PLO membership comprises separate and possibly contending paramilitary and political factions, the largest of which include Fatah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine (PFLP), and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine (DFLP). Factions of the PLO have advocated or carried out acts of terrorism. Abu Iyad organized the Fatah splinter group Black September in 1970, The group is arguably best known for seizing 11 Israeli athletes as hostages at the September 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich. All the athletes and 5 Black September operatives died during a gun battle with the West German police in what later became known as the Munich Massacre. The PFLP, founded in 1967 by George Havish, on September 6, 1970 hijacked 3 international passenger planes, landing 2 of them in Jordan and blowing up the third. Fatah leader and PLO chairman Yasser Arafat publicly renounced terrorism in December 1988 on behalf of the PLO, but Israel has stated that it has proof that Arafat continued to sponsor terrorism until his death in 2004. In the 1974 Malad Massacre, 22 Israeli high school students aged 14 to 16 from Safed were killed by 3 members of the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Before reaching the school, the trio shot and killed 2 Arab women, a Jewish man, his pregnant wife, and their 4-year-old son, and wounded several others. The People's Mujahedin of Iran, Pimoy or Mujahedin, ECOC, founded in 1965, is a socialist Islamic group that has fought Iran's government since the Khomeini Revolution. The group originated to oppose capitalism and what it perceived as Western exploitation of Iran under the Shah. The group would go on to play an important role in the Shah's overthrow, but was unable to capitalize on this in the following power vacuum. The group is suspected of having a membership of between 10,000 and 30,000. The group renounced violence in 2001 but remains a proscribed terror organization in Iran and in the United States. The EU, however, has removed the group from its terror list. The PMOI is accused of supporting other groups, such as the Jundullah. In 1975, Hagab Tarakian and Hagab Hagopian, with the help of sympathetic Palestinians, founded the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia Azala in Beirut during the Lebanese Civil War. At the time, Turkey was in political turmoil, and Hagopian believed that the time was right to avenge the Armenians who died during the Armenian genocide and to force the Turkish government to cede the territory of Wilsonian Armenia to establish a nation-state also in Korpur. In its Esenboga airport attack on 7 August 1982, 2 Azala rebels opened fire on civilians in a waiting room at the Esenboga International Airport in Ankara. 9 people died and 82 were injured. By 1986, the Azala had virtually ceased all attacks. The Partiya Karkaran Kurdistan Workers' Party or PKK was established in Turkey in 1978 as a Kurdish nationalist party. Founder Abdullah Öcalan was inspired by the Maoist theory of people's war. At that time, the group sought to create an independent Kurdish nation-state consisting of parts of southeastern Turkey, northeastern Iraq, northeastern Syria, and northwestern Iran. In 1984, the PKK transformed itself into a paramilitary organization and launched conventional attacks as well as bombings against Turkish governmental installations. In 1999, Turkish authorities captured Öcalan in Kenya. He was tried in Turkey and sentenced to life imprisonment. The PKK has since gone through a series of name and ideology changes. In 2004, Abdullah Öcalan announced a new ideology for the PKK from prison called Gynology, the Science and History of Women, radically diverging from its Marxist-Leninist roots. The ideology proposed a system of democratic confederalism without central nation-state government. Women have played a very important role in the development of this ideology during the 1990s and have also formed an army called the YPJ Women's Protection Units to defend the new society. Since then, the European Court of Justice has annulled the decision to class the PKK as a terrorist group on grounds that sufficient arguments were not presented. Europe. Founded in 1959 and functioning until 2018, Yusuke Azkatesuna, or ETA Basque for Basque Homeland and Freedom, pronounced ETA was an armed Basque nationalist separatist organization. Formed in response to the suppression of the Basque language and culture Under the regime of General Francisco Franco in power 1939–1975 in Spain, ETA evolved from an advocacy group for traditional Basque culture into an armed Marxist group demanding Basque independence. Many ETA victims were government officials. The group's first known victim, a police chief, died in 1968. In 1973, ETA operatives killed Franco's apparent successor, Admiral Luis Carrero Blanco, by planting an underground bomb under his habitual parking spot outside a Madrid church. In 1995, an ETA car bomb nearly killed José María Aznar, then the leader of the Conservative Popular Party, and in the same year investigators disrupted a plot to assassinate King Juan Carlos. Efforts by Spanish governments to negotiate with the ETA failed, and in 2003 the Spanish Supreme Court banned the Batasuna political party, which was determined to be the political arm of ETA. The Provisional Irish Republican Army (IRA) was an Irish nationalist movement founded in December 1969 when several militants, including Sean MacStiaffane, led by MacStiaffane in the early 1970s and by a group around Gerry Adams since the late 1970s, the Provisional IRA sought to bring about an all-island Irish state. Between 1969 and 1997, during a period known as the Troubles, the group conducted an armed campaign, including bombings, gun attacks, assassinations, and even a mortar attack on 10 Downing Street. On July 21, 1972, in an attack later dubbed Bloody Friday, the group set off 22 bombs, killing 9 and injuring 130. On July 28, 2005, the Provisional IRA Army Council announced an end to its armed campaign. The IRA is believed to have been a major exporter of arms and to have provided military training to groups such as the FARC in Colombia and the PLO. In the case of the latter, there has been a long-standing solidarity movement, as evidenced by many murals around Belfast. The Red Army faction RAF was a new left group founded in 1968 by Andreas Baader and Ulrich Meinhof in West Germany. Inspired by Che Guevara, Maoist socialism, and the Viet Cong, the group sought to raise awareness of the Vietnamese and Palestinian independence movements through kidnappings, taking embassies hostage, bank robberies, assassinations, bombings, and attacks on U.S. air bases. The group became arguably best known for 1977's German Autumn. The buildup leading to German Autumn began on April 7, when the RAF shot federal prosecutor Siegfried Buback. On July 30, it shot Jurgen Ponto, then head of the Dresdner Bank, in a failed kidnapping attempt. On September 5, the group kidnapped Hans-Martin Schleyer, a former SS officer and an important West German industrialist, executing him on October 19. The hijacking of the Lufthansa jetliner Landshut in October 1977 by the PFLP, a Palestinian group, is also considered to be part of German Autumn. The Red Brigades, a new left group founded by Renato Curcio and Alberto Franciscini in 1970 and based in Italy, sought to create a revolutionary state. The group carried out a series of bombings and kidnappings until the arrests of Curcio and Franciscini in the mid-1970s. Their successor as leader, Mario Morti, led the group toward more militarized and violent actions, including the kidnapping of former Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro on March 16, 1978. Moro was killed 56 days later. This led to an all-out assault on the group by Italian law enforcement and security forces, and condemnation from Italian left-wing radicals and even from imprisoned ex-leaders of the brigades. The group lost most of its social support, and public opinion turned strongly against it. In 1984 the group split, the majority faction becoming the Communist Combatant Party Red Brigades (PCC), and the minority faction reconstituting itself as the Union of Combatant Communists Red Brigades (UCC). Members of these groups carried out a handful of assassinations before almost all were arrested in 1989. The Americas. The Front de Libération du Québec (FLQ) was a Marxist nationalist group that sought to create an independent. Georges Scoters founded the group in 1963 and was inspired by Che Guevara and Algeria as a felon. The group was accused of bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations of politicians, soldiers, and civilians. On October 5, 1970, the FLQ kidnapped James Richard Cross, the British Trade Commissioner, and on October 10, the Minister of Labour and Vice Premier of Quebec, Pierre Laporte. Laporte was killed a week later. After these events, support for violence in order to attain Quebec's independence declined, and support increased for the Parti Québécois, which took power in Quebec in 1976. In Colombia, several paramilitary and guerrilla groups formed during the 1960s and afterwards. In 1983, President Fernando Belaunte of Peru described armed attacks on his nation's anti-narcotics police as narcoterrorism, i.e., which refers to violence waged by drug producers to extract political concessions from the government. Pablo Escobar's ruthless violence in his dealings with the Colombian and Peruvian governments has been probably two of the best known and best documented examples of narcoterrorism. Paramilitary groups associated with narcoterrorism include the Ejército de Liberación Nacional ELN, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia FARC, and the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia AUC. While the ELN and FARC were originally left-wing revolutionary groups, and the AUC was originally a right-wing paramilitary, all have conducted numerous attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, and engaged in the drug trade. The US and some European governments consider them terrorist organizations. The Jewish Defense League JDL was founded in 1969 by Rabbi Meir Kahane in New York City, with its declared purpose being the protection of Jews from harassment and antisemitism. Federal Bureau of Investigation statistics state that from 1980 to 1985, 15 attacks which the FBI classified as acts of terrorism were attempted in the U.S. by members of the JDL. The National Consortium for the Study of Terror and Responses to Terrorism states that, during the JDL first 2 decades of activity, it was an active terrorist organization. Kahane later founded the far-right Israeli political party Catch, which was banned from elections in Israel on the ground of racism. The JDL present-day website condemns all forms of terrorism. The Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional FALN, Armed Forces of National Liberation, is a nationalist group founded in Puerto Rico in 1974. Over the decade that followed, the group used bombings and targeted killings of civilians and police in pursuit of an independent Puerto Rico. The FALN in 1975 took responsibility for 4 nearly simultaneous bombings in New York City. The United States Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI) has classified the FALN as a terrorist organization. The Weather Underground, a.k.a. the Weathermen, began as a militant faction of the leftist Students for a Democratic Society (SDS) organization, and in 1969 took over the organization. Weathermen leaders, inspired by China's Maoists, the Black Panthers, and the 1968 student revolts in France, sought to raise awareness of its revolutionary anti-capitalist and anti-Vietnam War platform by destroying symbols of government power. From 1969 to 1974, the Weathermen bombed corporate offices, police stations, and Washington government sites such as the Pentagon. After the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, most of the group disbanded. Asia. The Japanese Red Army was founded by Fusaku Shigenabu in Japan in 1971 and attempted to overthrow the Japanese government and start a world revolution. Allied with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine (PFLP), the group committed assassinations, hijacked a commercial Japanese aircraft, and sabotaged a Shell oil refinery in Singapore. On May 30, 1972, Kozo Okamoto and other group members launched a machine gun and grenade attack at Israel's Lod airport in Tel Aviv, killing 26 people and injuring 80 others. 2 of the 3 attackers then killed themselves with grenades. Founded in 1976, the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, also called LTT or Tamil Tigers, was a militant Tamil nationalist political and paramilitary organization based in northern Sri Lanka. From its founding by Velupillai Prabhakaran, it waged a secessionist resistance campaign that sought to create an independent Tamil state in the northern and eastern regions of Sri Lanka. The conflict originated in measures the majority Sinhalese took that were perceived as attempts to marginalize the Tamil minority. The resistance campaign evolved into the Sri Lankan Civil War, one of the longest-running armed conflicts in Asia. The group carried out many bombings, including an April 21, 1987, car bomb attack at a Colombo bus terminal that killed 110 people. In 2009, the Sri Lankan military launched a major military offensive against the secessionist movement and claimed that it had effectively destroyed the LTT. Africa. In Kenya, because of the seeming ongoing failure of the Kenyan African Union to obtain political reforms from the British government through peaceful means, radical activists within the KAU set up a splinter group and organized a more militant kind of nationalism. By 1952, the Mau Mau consisted of Kikuyu fighters along with some Mbu and Meru recruits. The Mau Mau carried out attacks on political opponents, loyalist villages, raiding white farms and destroying livestock. The colonial administration declared a state of emergency and British forces were sent to Kenya. The majority of fighting was between loyalist and Mau Mau Kikuyu, so many scholars today now consider it a Kikuyu civil war. The Kenyan government considers the Mau Mau uprising a key step towards Kenya's eventual independence in the 1960s. Many Mau Mau members provided reports of torture and abuse suffered by them to foreign journalists, though the British forces did have strict orders not to mistreat Mau Mau terrorists. Founded in 1961, Umkhonto we Sizwe Mk was the military wing of the African National Congress. It waged a guerrilla campaign against the South African apartheid regime and was responsible for many bombings. MK launched its first guerrilla attacks against government installations on 16 December 1961. The South African government subsequently banned the group after classifying it as a terrorist organization. MK first leader was Nelson Mandela, who was tried and imprisoned for the group's acts. With the end of apartheid in South Africa, Umkhonto we Sizwe was incorporated into the South African Armed Forces. Late 20th century. In the 1980s and 1990s, Islamic militancy in pursuit of religious and political goals increased, many militants drawing inspiration from Iran's 1979 Islamic Revolution. In the 1990s, well-known violent acts that targeted civilians were the World Trade Center bombing by Islamic terrorists on February 26, 1993, the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway by Aum Shinrikyo on March 20, 1995, and the bombing of Oklahoma City's Murrah Federal Building by Timothy McVeigh a month later. This period also saw the rise of what is sometimes categorized as single-issue terrorism. If terrorism is the extension of domestic politics by other means, just as war is for diplomacy, then this represents the extension of pressure groups into violent action. Notable examples that grow in this period are anti-abortion terrorism and environmental terrorism. The Americas. The Contras were a counter-revolutionary militia formed in 1979 to oppose Nicaragua's Sandinista government. The Catholic Institute for International Relations asserted the following about Contra operating procedures in 1987, the record of the Contras in the field. America's Watch subsequently folded into Human Rights Watch, accused the Contras of targeting healthcare clinics and healthcare workers for assassination, kidnapping civilians, torturing civilians, executing civilians including children who were captured in combat, raping women, indiscriminately attacking civilians and civilian houses, seizing civilian property. The Contras disbanded after the election of Violeta Chamorro in 1990. The April 19, 1995 Oklahoma City bombing. The bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City claimed 168 lives and left over 800 people injured. McVeigh, who was convicted of first-degree murder and executed, said his motivation was revenge for U.S. government actions at Waco and Ruby Ridge. Pyroterrorism is an emerging threat from many areas of dry woodlands. Middle East, Middle East, 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 East. 659 people died in Lebanon between 1982 and 1986 in 36 suicide attacks directed against American, French, and Israeli forces by 41 individuals with predominantly leftist political beliefs who were adherents of both the Christian and Muslim religions. The 1983 Beirut barracks bombing by the Islamic Jihad organization, which killed 241 U.S. and 58 French peacekeepers and 6 civilians at the peacekeeping barracks in Beirut, was particularly deadly. Hezbollah Party of God is an Islamist movement and political party officially founded in Lebanon in 1985, 10 years after the outbreak of that country's civil war. Inspired by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution, the group originally sought an Islamic revolution in Lebanon and has long fought for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Lebanon. Led by Sheikh Sayed Hassan Nasrallah since 1992, the group has captured Israeli soldiers and carried out missile attacks and suicide bombings against Israeli targets. Egyptian Islamic Jihad, aka Al-Gama al-Islamiyya, is a militant Egyptian Islamist movement dedicated to the establishment of an Islamic state in Egypt. The group was formed in 1980 as an umbrella organization for militant student groups, which were formed after the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood renounced violence. It is led by Omar Abdul Rahman, who has been accused of participation in the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. In 1981, the group assassinated Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. On November 17, 1997, in what became known as the Luxor Massacre, it attacked tourists at the Temple of Hatshepsut Der El Bari. 6 men dressed as police officers machine-gunned 58 Japanese and European vacationers and 4 Egyptians. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103, a Pan-American World Airways flight from London's Heathrow International Airport to New York City's John F. Kennedy International Airport, was destroyed mid-flight over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, killing 270 people, including 11 on the ground. On January 31, 2001, Libyan Abdel Basit al-Megrahi was convicted by a panel of 3 Scottish judges of bombing the flight and was sentenced to 27 years imprisonment. In 2002, Libya offered financial compensation to victims' families in exchange for lifting of UN and US sanctions. In 2007, Megrahi was granted leave to appeal against his conviction, and in August 2009 was released on compassionate grounds by the Scottish executive due to his terminal cancer. The first Palestinian suicide attack took place in 1989 when a member of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad ignited a bomb on board Tel Aviv bus, killing 16 people. In the early 1990s, another group, Hamas, also became well known for suicide bombings. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi, and Mohammed Taha of the Palestinian wing of Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood had created Hamas in 1987, at the beginning of the First Intifada, an uprising against Israeli rule in the Palestinian territories, which mostly consisted of civil disobedience but sometimes escalated into violence. Hamas's militia, the Izz-ed-Din al-Qassam Brigades, began its own suicide bombings against Israel in 1993, eventually accounting for about 40% of them. Palestinian militant organizations have been responsible for rocket attacks on Israel, IED attacks, shootings, and stabbings. After winning legislative elections, Hamas since June 2007 has governed the Gaza portion of the Palestinian territories. Hamas is designated as a terrorist organization by the European Union, Canada, Israel, Japan, and the United States. Australia and the United Kingdom have designated the military wing of Hamas the Izzeddin al-Qasim Brigades as a terrorist organization. The organization is banned in Jordan. It is not regarded as a terrorist organization by Iran, Russia, Norway, Switzerland, Brazil, Turkey, China, and Qatar, as well as Hamas, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Palestine Liberation Front, PFLP General Command, and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade were all listed as terrorist organizations by the U.S. State Department in the 1990s. On February 25, 1994, Baruch Goldstein, an American-born Israeli physician, perpetrated the Cave of the Patriarchs massacre in the city of Hebron. Goldstein shot and killed between 30 and 54 Muslim worshippers inside the Ibrahimi Mosque within the Cave of the Patriarchs and wounded another 125 to 1. Goldstein, who after the shooting was found beaten to death with iron bars in the mosque, was a supporter of Kach, an Israeli political party founded by Rabbi Meir Kahane that advocated the expulsion of Arabs from Israel and the Palestinian territories. In the aftermath of the Goldstein attack and Kach statements praising it, Kach was outlawed in Israel. Today, Kach and a breakaway group, Kain Chai, are considered terrorist organizations by Israel, Canada, the European Union, and the United States. The far-right anti-miscegenation group Lahava, headed by former Kach member Bensi Gopstein, is politically active inside Israel and its occupied territories. Asia. Aum Shinrikyo, now known as Aleph, was a Japanese religious group founded by Shoko Asahara in 1984 as a yogic meditation group. Later, in 1990, Asahara and 24 other members campaigned for election to the House of Representatives under the banner of Shinri to Supreme Truth Party. None were voted in, and the group began to militarize. Between 1990 and 1995, the group attempted several apparently unsuccessful violent attacks using the methods of biological warfare, using botulinum toxin and anthrax spores. On June 28, 1994, Aum Shinrikyo members released sarin gas from several sites in the Kaichai Heights neighborhood of Matsumoto, Japan, killing 8 and injuring 200 in what became known as the Matsumoto Incident. 7 months later, on March 20, 1995, Aum Shinrikyo members released sarin gas in a coordinated attack on 5 trains in the Tokyo subway system, killing 12 commuters and damaging the health of about 5,000 others in what became known as the subway sarin incident. Daizayatai sarin shijayan, Shikatetsu sarin jayan. In May 1995, Asahara and other senior leaders were arrested and the group's membership rapidly decreased. In 1985, Air India Flight 182 flying from Canada was blown up by a bomb while in Irish airspace, killing 329 people, including 280 Canadian citizens, mostly of Indian birth or descent, and 22 Indians. The incident was the deadliest act of air terrorism before 9/11 and the first bombing of a 747 jumbo jet, which would set a pattern for future air terrorism plots. The crash occurred within an hour of the fatal Narita airport bombing, which also originated from Canada, without the passenger for the bag that exploded on the ground. Evidence from the explosions, witnesses and wiretaps of militants pointed to an attempt to actually blow up 2 airliners simultaneously by members of the Babur Khalsa Khalistan movement militant group based in Canada to punish India for attacking the Golden. Europe. The Iranian embassy siege took place in 1980 after a group of 6 armed men stormed the Iranian embassy in South Kensington, London. The government ordered the Special Air Service SAS. This response set the tone for how Western governments would respond to terrorism, replacing an era of negotiation with one of military intervention. Chechen separatists, led by Shamil Basayev, carried out several attacks on Russian targets between 1994 and 2006. In the June 1995 Budyanovsk hospital hostage crisis, Basayev-led separatists took over 1,000 civilians hostage in a hospital in the southern Russian city of Budyanovsk. When Russian special forces attempted to free the hostages, 105 civilians and 25 Russian troops were killed. 21st century major events most deadly 300 deaths or more or most covered after the 2001 September 11 attacks include the 2002 Akshardam Temple attack, 2002 Moscow theater siege, the 2003 Istanbul bombings, the 2004 Madrid train bombings, the 2004 Bislin school hostage crisis. In the 21st century, most victims of terrorist attacks have been killed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Nigeria, Syria, Pakistan, India, Somalia, or Yemen. Europe, Middle East, Middle East, 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 East. Osama bin Laden, closely advised by Egyptian Islamic Jihad leader Ayman al-Zawahiri in 1988, founded Al-Qaeda Arabic, LQDet, meaning the base, an Islamic jihadist movement to replace Western-controlled or dominated Muslim countries with Islamic fundamentalist regimes. In pursuit of that goal, bin Laden issued a 1996 manifesto that vowed violent jihad against U.S. military forces based in Saudi Arabia. On August 7, 1998, individuals associated with al-Qaeda and Egyptian Islamic Jihad carried out simultaneous bombings of 2 U.S. embassies in Africa, which resulted in 224 deaths. On October 12, 2000, al-Qaeda carried out the USS Cole bombing, a suicide bombing of the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Cole harbored in the Yemeni port of Aden. The bombing killed 17 U.S. sailors. On September 11, 2001, 19 men affiliated with al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial passenger jets, all bound for California, crashing 2 of them into the World Trade Center in New York City, the 3rd into the Pentagon in Arlington County, Virginia, and the 4th originally intended to target Washington, D.C., either the White House. As a result of the attacks, 2996 people, including the 19 hijackers, perished, and more than 6,000 others were injured. The United States responded to the attacks by launching the War on Terror. Specifically, on October 7, 2001, it invaded Afghanistan. On October 26, 2001, the U.S. enacted the Patriot Act that expanded the powers of U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies. Many countries followed with similar legislation. Under the Obama administration, the U.S. changed tactics, moving away from ground combat with large numbers of troops to the use of drones and special forces. This campaign eliminated much of al-Qaeda's most senior members, including a strike by SEAL Team 6 that resulted in the death of Osama bin Laden in 2011. On Israel's northern border, after its unilateral withdrawal from southern Lebanon in May 2000, Hezbollah launched numerous Katyusha rocket attacks against non-civilian and civilian areas within northern Israel. Within Israel, the 1993-2008 Second Intifada involved in part a series of suicide bombings against civilian and non-civilian targets. 1,100 Israelis were killed in the Second Intifada, the majority being civilians. A 2007 study of Palestinian suicide bombings from September 2000 through August 2005 found that 40% were carried out by Hamas's Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades and roughly 26% by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad PJ and Fatah militias. Also, between 2001 and January 2009, over 8,600 rocket attacks were launched from the Gaza Strip, were launched into civilian areas and non-civilian areas inside Israel, causing deaths, injuries, and psychological trauma. Formed in 2003, Jundallah is a Sunni insurgent group from the Balak region of Iran and neighboring Pakistan. It has committed numerous attacks within Iran, stating that it is fighting for the rights of the Sunni minority there. In 2005, the group attempted to assassinate Iran's president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. The group takes credit for other bombings, including the 2007 Sahedin bombings. Iran and other sources accuse the group of being a front for or supported by other nations, in particular the US and Pakistan. As the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq increases in size and power, their attacks are affecting all parts of the world, even in their own backyard of Turkey. Taking place in Istanbul, a suicide bomber once again detonated a car bomb, killing 4 people and injuring 31. No extremist group took responsibility for the attack, but the attacker Mehmet Öztürk was linked to have ties with ISIS. This was just days after the car bomb attack in Turkey's capital of Ankara, killing 37 people. The U.S. Security Council asked for the repeated terror attacks on Turkey to stop, and that the war on terror will just become stronger due to actions like these killing innocent people. Since the attacks, Israel has requested that its citizens not travel to Turkey unless it's necessary. Asia. On December 27, 2007, two-time elected Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto was assassinated during a gathering she was having with her supporters. A suicide bomber detonated a bomb along with other extremists against her, shooting off guns, killing the Prime Minister and 14 other people. She was immediately rushed to the hospital and was pronounced dead. She was believed to be target because she was warning Pakistan along with the world of the uprising jihadist groups and extremist groups gaining power. The responsibility of her death falls on the president of the time, Pervez Musharraf, who also was the ex-military chief. She had several conversations with Musharraf about upping her security due to the increase of death threats she was receiving, and he denied her request. Although al-Qaeda took responsibility for her death, it is seen in the eye of the people as former President Pervez Musharraf's fault for not taking her concerns seriously. However, during his trial, he denies that no conversation happened between him and Benazir Bhutto about the security of her life. The 2008 Mumbai attacks were more than 10 coordinated shooting and bombing attacks across Mumbai, India's largest city, by Lashkar-e-Taiba, a Pakistani Islamic terrorist organization with ties to ISI, Pakistan's secret service. The 6 main targets were Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, formerly known as Victoria Station, the Taj Mahal Palace and Tower Hotel. 6 explosions were reported in the hotel. 200 hostages were rescued from the burning building. A group of European Parliament committee members were staying at the hotel at the time, but none were injured. 2 attackers held hostages in the hotel. Leopold Cafe, a popular cafe and bar on the causeway that was one of the first places to be attacked, resulting in the death of 10 people. The Trident Oberoi Hotel, 1 explosion was heard here where the president of Madrid was eating. He was not injured. Nariman House, a Jewish community center, had a hostage situation by 2 attackers. Eventually the hostages became freed when an aerial view of the building was displayed and NSG stormed the building, eventually killing the 2 attackers. Kama Hospital. The attacks were carried out by 10 gunmen that arrived on speedboats boat from Pakistan, separating, going building to building, grabbing hostages, setting bombs up and mass murdering with guns. Eventually 9 out of the 10 gunmen were killed. Pakistan denied that the men were a part of their country, but eventually released documents that 3 of the men were from Pakistan and that cases would be opened against them. The attacks, which drew widespread condemnation across the world, began on 26 November 2008 and lasted until 29 November, killing at least 173 people. And on January 14, 2016, a series of terrorist attacks took place in Jakarta, Indonesia, resulting in 8 dead. The responsibility of these attacks were claimed by ISIS. Counterterrorism has named this type of attack marauding terrorist firearms attack because of the fast reaction needed by local policemen to stop the gunfire attack from the Tay. The attack on Jakarta is linked to a bigger picture of terror in the Indonesian country for those of ISIS. Indonesia is home of the largest regional terror groups, housing 7 Islamist extremist groups, leaving the thoughts that ISIS is trying to establish a satellite city in Indonesia, due to the fact that it has the largest Muslim population. Although ISIS branches have not yet reached the land of Southeast Asia in big masses, There is the fear that it is only a matter of time until Indonesia's small extremist groups grow in masses once direct contact with ISIS is made. Once contact is established, local terror groups will quickly mobilize to carry out the tasks that ISIS asks of them. ISIS will turn to Southeast Asia because it is only evident that they will lose control of the Middle East. America's 2001 also saw the second acknowledged act of bioterrorism with the 2001 anthrax attacks, the first being intentional food poisoning conducted in the Dalles, Oregon by Rajneesh followers in 1984, when letters carrying anthrax spores were posted to several major American media outlets and two Democratic Party politicians. This resulted in several of the first fatalities attributed to a bioterror attack. The more recent terrorist attack in the United States have included the 2015 San Bernardino attack, the Boston Marathon bombing, the 2016 shooting of Dallas police officers, and the shooting of multiple black parishioners at church and car attack on anti-fascist protesters in Charlottesville by right-wing extremists and white supremacists. There have been calls by some analysts to describe violence committed by incels as terrorism. List of non-state groups accused of terrorism.